Shortly after I started college, I began seeing a therapist to help me manage my anxiety. The switch to this new chapter of life had proven too much for me to handle on my own. During an early session, my therapist asked me what I like to do for fun. I told him that I like to play video games, which is typically what I did in my free time. This answer elicited a smirk from my therapist. When I questioned him, he was quick to theorize that video games were an excuse for me to avoid socializing, a way for me to stay in my dorm room and delay making friends. An escape from life. Unsurprisingly, I quickly refuted his theory and defended the hobby that I loved so much. I can't really remember the rest of our conversation as it took place about a decade ago, but that exchange has always echoed in my mind. It left me asking a number of different questions in the years since. Was my therapist right? Should I find a new hobby? But the most pervasive question that was imprinted and what I want to discuss today is, why do we play video games?
What? Nothing.
Let's get the obvious out of the way up front. Video games are fun. Okay, we all grasp that, but why? What actually makes these things enjoyable to spend our time with? I can only speak for myself, but I imagine there may be quite a bit of overlap here with how many of you feel as well. It's impossible to unpack this topic without exploring the idea of control. Various forms of entertainment all enable us to peer into different worlds, but unlike film or television, video games permit us to directly influence what we see. This manifests in myriad ways, but let's examine a couple a little more closely. Hogwarts Legacy is a game I spoke about in a recent video and works well for our first example. Based on the Harry Potter series, Hogwarts Legacy unleashes the player into a huge open world inspired by the books and films. Now, let's set the overall quality of the game aside for a second and just view it conceptually. If you're a fan of Harry Potter, how could you not be compelled by the prospect of being able to explore Hogwarts Castle to your heart's content? It's an iconic location brought to life in the Harry Potter movies, but here you can explore it at your own pace. You get to discover the hidden passageways and secret rooms. It's truly novel to explore a location that you've seen already in another medium, but more broadly, there's something special about having the autonomy to dictate the pace at which your entertainment unfolds. I'm not sure if any of you can relate, but typically, when I start a game, I play it extremely slowly. I pore over the opening levels with ridiculous attention to detail. I retread old ground multiple times just in case I missed any hidden collectibles or resources. The Deus Ex series is a perfect example of this in action. While not an open world, each Deus Ex game places you into multiple open hubs that are stuffed with side quests, hidden areas, and optional NPC conversations. When I gain access to one of these hubs, I methodically pore over every inch. I refuse to progress the main story until I've seen every optional point of interest there is to track down. As I progress further in games, I tend to pick up the pace, but there's something so special to me about taking those opening hours at a snail's pace.
Not gonna go all wonky on us now, Hansa, are ya?
Well, if I do, McCready, I guarantee you'll never see it coming.
Whether you're near the beginning or end of a game, the joy of exploration really can't be overstated. It's truly one of the defining features of video games, a component that further separates it from other forms of entertainment. As open world games have grown more ubiquitous, the freedom for players to stretch their legs has only increased. I'm sure you've all had a moment where, deep into a game, you discover some hidden area or strange landmark. Its purpose isn't clear, but for a few moments, it feels as though you might be the only person to have ever seen it. There's something profoundly special about that feeling, and it's one I don't think will ever lose its novelty. Control over the manner in which you interact with the game's world and mechanics is compelling in its own right, but we've also begun to see an increasing level of autonomy given to the player regarding a game's narrative. In the early days of the medium, a game story was either an afterthought or completely non-existent. That has obviously changed over the decades, but in some cases, we've even evolved beyond the idea of a predetermined story. Now, modern RPGs and adventure games have begun offering opportunities to choose how a game's story unfolds.
Well, I think Groot's more convincing, in the traditional monster sense.
The first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead was my initial exposure to this kind of game. The intro features our protagonist, Lee, in the back of a police car being transported out of Atlanta. As the player, you're presented with various dialogue options as the police officer questions Lee. You can answer politely, antagonistically, or even say nothing at all. This flexibility applies to the entire game, and while it starts out innocuously, the stakes will inevitably raise, with characters living or dying based upon the choices you make. I'll never forget how enamored I was with the idea of having direct control over how the game's story unfolded. I agonized over every decision, made all the more intensive by the fact that your choices had to be made on a strict time limit. Each story beat was more meaningful because I felt like I had a direct hand in getting to that point. I felt as though I was, to some extent, writing the story myself as I played the game. In the years since, I've come to see that many choice-based games employ some smoke and mirrors to achieve the desired effect, but I think we'll continue to see games attempt branching stories in more ambitious, less illusory ways.
It smells like... duty.
As alluring as Control can be, what are video games without the chaos of competition? I've morphed into more of a single-player gamer as I've transitioned into adulthood, but when I was a kid, gaming was the default way of bonding with my closest friends. There wasn't a single game that defined our multiplayer experiences. As the years passed, we tried endless titles, typically rented from Blockbuster, based upon whichever one had the coolest looking box art. And it was just so fun. It didn't matter if we were fighting against each other or working together in some kind of co-op campaign. Playing video games with my friends was my definition of pure bliss. As I grew into my middle and high school years, my local multiplayer pursuits gave way to online gaming. I was late to the online party as I was strictly a Nintendo gamer back in the day, but even the Wii eventually played host to some team deathmatch. Call of Duty became my drug of choice, and yes, you could play Call of Duty online on the Wii. My after-school evenings and summer breaks became filled with multiplayer matches until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Say what you want about the Call of Duty series, but man, those games were fun. I don't play them much anymore, but back in the day, I was hopelessly hooked. Call of Duty Black Ops was the first game in the series to allow for voice chat on the Wii. I snagged a headset as quickly as I could and dove in headfirst. In general, online voice chat is kind of horrific. It's filled with obscenity-laced arguments and antagonism, but in the midst of the fighting, you can actually make some long-distance friends. I certainly did, but what's so unique about this is just who they were. Our main group consisted of myself, an introverted middle schooler, a foul-mouthed father of two from New York, a military veteran living in New Orleans, and a young couple from North Carolina, one of whom ultimately went to prison. Should I have been talking to these people? I'm not sure, but there was a stretch there where every evening, after all of us had finished school or work or criminal activities apparently, we all sat down to play a game together. For an hour or two every night, we became a platoon of soldiers operating in lockstep to keep each other safe and achieve victory. Without video games, we would have almost certainly never met, but we did, if only for a time. Recounting all these different video games reminds me just how unbelievably varied the medium is. I mean, seriously, the possibilities are endless. In just this video, I've shown dozens of games that are completely distinct from one another. There are so many different scenarios you can experience, which admittedly is the same for other entertainment media. What makes video games far more varied is the interactivity. For example, you may have two different horror games. One is very slow-paced and predicated on solving puzzles and exploring the environment. The other is much more high-octane in nature, providing the player with ample weapons and ammunition to fight back. They're both horror games, sure, but one is traditional survival horror and the other more modern action horror. The various mechanics and design decisions of games have led to innumerable granular genres and subgenres, with many more that haven't even been invented yet. And that's just on the gameplay side of things. From a presentational standpoint, games are just as interesting. While initially limited to blocky pixels that only vaguely represented what the artists wanted to convey, developers are now able to portray stunning worlds and vistas that can sometimes look photorealistic. And yet, many devs opt for something completely different, creating bizarre and unique art styles that often look like nothing else you've ever played before. Indie developers in particular tend to cook up some of the most interesting games in the industry, unbound by corporate pressure and expectation. All of these factors add up to create an art form that's completely unpredictable. I could go on and on about this for a long time, digging further into the minutia, but I'm not sure my foundational answer to this question can really be articulated. There's just something about video games. I love film. I love television and music. I'm a huge consumer of entertainment and I love each medium in a different way. But there's just something about video games that separates them from the rest of the pack. My favorite time to play a game is at night. Got my TV in my room so I can hunker down into bed and game a bit before I go to sleep. That time each night is a huge motivator to fight through the day. No matter what happened at work, no matter what stressors presented themselves, I can jump into my current game of choice at the end of it all and just decompress for a while. I can just escape from life, if only for a little bit. Now, wait a second. Escape from life? Who do I sound like? Yeah, that's right. Maybe my therapist was onto something. But as I've grown older and less defensive, I've come to realize that escape isn't the condescending word I once believed it to be. Look, life is really hard. It's stressful, it's overwhelming, at times it's absolutely terrifying. The point of art, of entertainment, of storytelling is to give us a little break, a small reprieve from all of the noise that can sometimes make life feel like more trouble than it's worth. For me, no other art form cuts through the noise like video games. I guess, as it turns out, there's nothing wrong with a little escape. It might be the only thing keeping us sane. That word though, escape, it's not quite right. Maybe we don't play video games in an attempt to leave our world, but rather to accept an invitation into someone else's. Each night when I play a video game, I take a virtual companion's hand, agreeing to become a part of their lives for the next couple of hours. I agree to immerse myself into their world and do whatever I can to help them save it, destroy it, or just walk with them in it. I get to meet new people, play by a different set of rules, spend some time somewhere else, if only for a little while.